Hey guys, this is Anand from AnandTech.com. We are back for another live Google Hangout with ARM. This time we've got ARM fellow and GPU expert Jem Davies. Jem, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Good afternoon.
So this is, kind of a different situation for us, right? We've talked with a lot of ARM folks generally about CPUs and kind of the more traditional aspects of compute that we cover. But you're the GPU guy. So before we get to like the actual GPU questions, let's talk a bit about how you got to be with ARM. What's your story there?
So goodness. 10.5 years ago, I joined ARM and started working on adding multiprocessor support to Linux. I was working on the kernel, and we had plenty of fun finding the memory coherency bugs and getting it all sorted out in the kernel. But actually, I've worked alongside and underneath and with ARM for since it's been going. Some of the founders, friends of mine I've known for a long time, and I worked for a company. I had my own business. We were doing consultancy work alongside ARM for some of ARM's clients. So yeah, it's kind of in the blood.
So how did you go from enabling multiprocessor support to working on GPUs?
It's an amusing story, actually, and there's a career lesson in this for several people. My boss walked into my office and said, "Are you busy?" And obviously, as any fool would understand, the correct answer is yes, tremendously busy, much too busy to do anything you want me to do. And I said, not too bad. And he said, "I want you to go out and buy a GPU company." And that was where it's all started back in 2005. And that then led to the acquisition of Phalanx in 2006, and it's been downhill ever since. It's been a huge, huge blast.
So we recently did a story on, thanks to you guys actually for opening up kind of your Midgard architecture to us, and allowing us to go deeper on it. And so in that story that we published, and if you guys haven't read it, I highly recommend it.
I most certainly have.
So to the audience, Ryan Smith did a great job on it. And in there, you do get some of the background on that GPU acquisition that gave ARM a GPU team. So one of the things that Ryan pointed out is that your Midgard architecture looks very, very different from what he's used to evaluating. Both, if we compare it to like Imagination and the mobile GPU players that have been forthcoming with their architectures to us, but especially with, the NVIDIAs and AMDs of the world. For the viewers watching now, can you help us understand, how and why you arrived at this approach with Midgard?
Yes, so before Midgard, we had the so-called Utgard architecture, which was Mali 400, Mali 200, 300, 400, 450, all of that family. And that's been very successful in providing low-power graphics. And the Midgard architecture is really a development on from there, where we've taken parts of the architecture and unpicked them and parallelized them to get higher throughput.
But so sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say it's all about utilization. We're all chasing, in the end, all GPU manufacturers are trying to run their, indeed CPU manufacturers, trying to run as many of those functional units for as high a percentage of the time as possible.
Yeah, and the reasoning behind that obviously is that this is stuff. It's kind of like the argument for not putting physical buttons on a phone, right? In that when you put a physical button on a phone, you've now acquired and you've committed a portion of the design to having this button. And if that button isn't useful in an application, then now you've kind of wasted space. And you could say the same thing about functional units on silicon, in that you've got a finite die area. Everything you put down had better contribute to performance, because if not, if it's sitting there going idle, then it's effectively a wasted opportunity. I guess my question with regards to Midgard is, everyone else seems to take this this thread looming wavefront sort of approach to how do you deal with work, right? Which is you get all of these threads and then you kind of interleave them across this kind of very, very wide machine with tons of functional units. And you guys don't do that at all, right? You operate almost like a multi-core CPU.
Yes, and you're not going to encourage me to be rude about other people's architectures. They're clever. They employ clever people, who have clever designs, and we're all chasing the same thing. There are slightly different ways of doing it. What we've done is we think, relatively clever and useful. But there's not to say that there are not other ways of doing it. In the end, the GPU architecture is really cool for people to work on, because you can encapsulate a lot of this sort of design behind software that we write, not publishing like the CPU guy is my counterpart in the CPU architecture team. Obviously, his architecture is very, very public, and you have to commit to supporting it and not changing it. And there are lots of people writing code for your architecture that aren't you. Whereas actually most of the code that utilizes our architecture at the lowest possible level, the drivers, the compiler, etc. Of course, we are providing all of those. So we get a chance to try some different things, and that's really cool.
So what you're basically saying is that because you're, by default are more abstracted from, your developer than, let's say, your CPU guys are.
Yes.
Your approach, although novel, shouldn't actually matter to the end developer, and I don't disagree with that. I guess my question is, at least in the traditional compute spaces, we're used to seeing everyone converge on the same solution or a very similar solution to the same problem. So whenever we see divergence, it's super interesting, right? Because it means one of two things. It means, hey, here's a company that has arrived at a different conclusion or a different approach to answering the problem, and this is the right one, or that at some point they're going to kind of evolve this to kind of match the rest of the industry. Do you believe that there's any my goal here is never to kind of get you to disparage a competitor, but it's a question of, clearly you see merit in what they're doing, you see merit in what you're doing, and obviously all of this stuff is, at least in the devices that we see, ends up being reasonably competitive. Do you believe that there is a future where you guys embrace any of that more TLP-centric approach to GPU architecture?
Oh, quite possibly. I think the winners in this space will be the people who've taken the best of everything. As you say, there are areas in which a warp style, a scalar architecture has advantages. There are areas in which a vector style architecture has advantages, and the winner will undoubtedly be the designer who extracts the best out of both worlds.
Interesting.
Anytime you ever hear anyone take a completely radical "it's my way" or the highway viewpoint, you should rightly be suspicious, because at the end of the day, we're not doing physics, we're doing engineering. Engineering actually has to work and is usually a compromise, and it's slightly less pure, because actually you will always get people using what you design in a different way to what you expected, and you can't control the way they always use it. And so, yeah, but best of all worlds would be my pick.
What is the lifespan for one of your GPU architectures? Do you design and commit for 3 years, or is it 5 years? What, in general, how long do you keep these things around?
So contractually, we don't have really to make any great commitments. It's unlike, as I say, unlike my colleague who's designing the CPU architecture, where it absolutely has to run code people wrote, 20 years ago, or whatever it is. And when you bring in a new architecture like the 64-bit ARM CPU architecture, you have to be very, very careful. Because we have the abstraction of the APIs, OpenCL, RenderScript, OpenGLES, etc., we can have a little more freedom. The constraints are mostly economic and the constraints of engineering. You can't produce a new architecture every year. You would go broke, and you'd never deliver anything that worked. And I'd be in trouble.
One of the interesting things that we pointed out in our Midgard architecture article was that, at least in the mobile space, we're not used to seeing, with the exception kind of you guys in Qualcomm, we're not used to seeing an IP provider that supplies both CPU and GPU IP. And one of the points that Ryan made was, that's why there's this kind of pervasive FP64 or just 64-bit support within the Midgard architecture. Do you see your teams working and the GPU teams at ARM working closer with the CPU teams going forward, or do you still kind of remain fairly separate, or as separate as you have been in the past?
Well, we've actually worked pretty closely together. So what happened was it was obvious that we needed a new architecture with Midgard. There were a number of technical trends coming down towards us. The GPU compute was definitely going to happen. People wanted higher resolutions even within graphics. They wanted to do all sorts of other things with it. A unified architecture was definitely the way to go. There were higher and better specified precisions coming through, both with DirectX and with OpenCL and OpenGLES. There was a whole sort of tidal wave of features coming down the pipe. Okay, we could try and bodge it, or we could make the step and go to a new architecture. And that was what Midgard was all about. So then you start looking around and saying, okay, we're definitely going to do this. Is there anything else we should be paying attention to when this is being done? And 64-bit was the obvious one. When you look at the obvious trends in DRAM usage in consumer devices, it was quite clearly the case that depending on how long you think the architecture is going to live for, 64-bit is going to land fair and square in the middle of that. And so it was. So we said, right, okay, well, you know what it's like. Once you've taken the top off, you can fix this, you can fix that. So you can do a whole bunch of changes to the architecture, of which 64-bit was one of them. GPU compute was definitely one. We said, we were going to do this properly if we were going to do it at all. And yeah, those changes came along. At that point, we started working very closely with the CPU guys, new bus standards, 64-bit architecture, memory system changes, going to a coherent bus infrastructure and so forth. And actually, we stole some of their stuff as well. One of the interesting things about a GPU is it's a programmable processor. Yes, there are some incredibly complicated corners where you have to have real purity of graphics thought. We have some people who live, eat, dream, sleep, breathe 3D plane equations. But actually, there's also an execution unit in there that, in many ways, has a lot of similarities with the CPU. And we don't have to make all the same mistakes. We can steal some of their work as well. And when you get down to it, it's a data plane device. There's huge amounts of data being fed into it, huge amounts of data coming out of it. So we need a very efficient memory system. That was another area where we could steal both people, experienced people, and also technology. So it's worked very well for us for some time. Now, of course, we are still in the components business. There are some people, when we started out, used our GPU, but not ARM CPU. There are some people now who use ARM CPU, but not ARM's GPU. And that will always continue, and we will always support those sort of people. So there's always merit in having, components. So if ARM's target market is everything in the world that has a processor in it, then ARM's GPU target market is only everything in the world that has a screen. There will always be cases where we don't always go together. And so yeah, you have to have good CPUs, you have to have good GPUs. But where it would be good is if you could have something that was even better if you used them together.
Yeah, and I guess that's where the interesting kind of potential future comes into play here. Do you see a situation where, yes, you are and likely will always be in this component, IP business. Do you see a potential future where you have an IP block that is effectively CPU and GPU in one?
I think IP block depends on your exact use of terminology. I think we would always have individual IP blocks that will always be individually for sale. I think there will come a time when we have subsystems. ARM has been moving into the subsystems business for some time, where people will say, you know what, I need one of those, and one of those. I could buy the individual parts, or I could buy it from ARM connected up. We would always support people who either do their own, and of course you have some very obvious customers in our markets who build their own GPUs still. And we would always support those and people who buy GPUs from other places. But it makes perfect sense. In the end, we're making system design, we're chip designers' lives easier. That's at heart what ARM does. You could do it yourself if you employed a bunch of clever engineers. You could do this, no problem at all. It'll take you a few years, but you get there. At the end of the day, we're doing what they could do cheaper, faster, better. Hopefully.
So it's really this isn't a ARM GPUs must dominate the world sort of approach, right? Versus just hey, if you need it, we're going to provide you with something that's pretty good to begin with.
I haven't joined the sainthood just yet. Obviously, the great thing about competition is that's the only way you know whether you've won. So I'm not suggesting we have some very competitive people working here, of which I am one, because we certainly are, and we have every intentions of being number one. But we will get there by being better than everybody else, not by strong-arming people. That's just not the way ARM does business. So if it's easier, cheaper, faster, better, increased time to market, whatever, if it's one of those, somebody will pay for us to do things, and we lose sight of that at our peril.
Do you? And so that's a very welcoming thing to hear. It's not something that we normally hear from a lot of the chip providers in this space. So yeah, maybe not sainthood, but pretty close.
I think my wife would beg to differ, but yeah, let's probably move on from there.
So that kind of brings up an interesting point here, in that if your target market is everything in the world that has a screen attached, that's a lot of potential devices, right? Where do you optimize for? Because you only have two, I guess, prongs of your GPU roadmap, and you can scale up and down with core count. But is that sufficient to kind of cover everything? Like, I'm assuming you have to, with each of those product families, you have to, with Midgard and Utgard, you have to pick one device or one type of form factor or resolution or combination of facets that you optimize for, and then you stretch up and you stretch down. Can you cover the market with just these two families? And how do you pick what you optimize for?
You can cover a surprising, excuse me, you can cover a surprising amount of the market with what we do. The question is not really, does the performance requirements change across the different market segments, so much as the performance profiles. So, excuse me, the performance requirements in a, shall we say, high-end games console are very different. They're quite a lot higher, but content is king. The games developers, for example, have invested a huge amount of money, in some cases, tens of millions of dollars, in creating their content. So what they want to do is to utilize that content on as many different platforms as they can. Clearly, they'll turn the performance needs down as they go from one platform to another. But if anyone can crack the holy grail of having a game that runs on the console, on your television, on your laptop, on your tablet, on your phone, on your portable games console, on your exercise machine as you're doing your morning exercise, then they're going to clean up. There's money to be made there. Can we optimize? Can we cover everything? Perhaps not. If I really truly were going to scale up to a 300-watt mains powered with a fan device, we would probably make some different design choices. But in the battery-powered space, we can certainly scale from clamshell type devices down through tablets, through smaller tablets, phablets, phones, down to entry-level phones, no problem at all. And it transpires that actually, Mali 400, a single-core variant of that, makes a very good target for the new wearable segment as well. We're doing quite well down there as well. So, never say never, but we're certainly covering a large section of the market. As soon as you have a section of the market that steps off the different API, so for example, if you went down below OpenGL ES2 and said, well, actually, I don't need that stuff. I'm going to have some significant subset of OpenGL ES2. Then there might be a need for a different GPU down there. Or conversely, if you wanted to produce a compute-only GPU for use in supercomputers, then we would probably optimize slightly differently at that end as well.
Given, so that inspires a whole bunch of questions here. At the high end, given ARM's interest in pursuing the enterprise space, is there a room for a compute-focused GPU? And then at the very, very low end, can you cover, yes, we've seen Mali 400 in wearables, but I don't think any of the wearables to date have been all that power optimized. Is there room for something kind of more tailor-made there as well?
Yes, I think there probably is at both ends. And in the end, I'm lucky enough to be in an expanding market with new and expanding market segments. I don't have to pick them all off at the same time. So at the moment, we're not producing a GPU targeted at petaflop supercomputers, but that doesn't mean to say we won't. There are some challenges with that. We'd obviously have to go to ECC and have a whole bunch of RAS type requirements there. And the market is quite small in terms of volume. It's quite big in terms of money, but it's quite small in terms of volume. As we go down to wearables, there are possibilities, as you say. We could optimize down there, or we could say actually what we've got is good enough, and the market will decide.
Do you believe that one of those two markets is more interesting than the other?
Personally or corporately?
Personally.
Personally, yes. I think wearables is tremendously interesting. There was a partner of ours recently who said, "No, you've got it all wrong. It's not about power consumption. Wearables is all about fashion, sorry, it's not cost conscious. We were worrying that we had to reduce the silicon area down for wearables." And he said, no. They'll pay lots for it. Expensive devices end up in wearables, but you need to concentrate absolutely on power consumption. And that sort of gave my head a twist. I had to think about that for a while. But yes, I think if we could get the wearables use cases down to a week's worth of charge, 2 weeks worth of charge, a month's worth of charge, then I think it opens up whole new and interesting use cases.
And do you believe that, at least for your role in that, pursuing this week or month's worth of charge, do you believe that you have, I'm assuming to get there you would have to use something other than what you have today in terms of publicly available GPU architectures?
Well, it kind of remains to be seen. There's a whole bunch of work being done looking at how often people interact with their wearables devices and what the nature of that interaction is. If people are looking at their wearable device to just see what the time is, or to look at their heart rate, or just to check that a bunch of stuff, have they had any emails or messages, then the GPU interaction for that may actually be quite low. Getting the whole wearables thing down to the right power budget may be as much about new display technologies as it is and battery technologies. It may be all about that. That's more than optimizing the GPU. You have to be careful not to optimize beyond the point at which it's relevant. So who is responsible for all the power consumption? Where is it coming from?
Okay. One of the things you hit on a little while ago is this idea that a game developer building content for a high-end device, spending tens of millions of dollars, ideally they want to leverage that and reuse that IP across as many different platforms as possible. At the same point, if you look at companies like NVIDIA and as well as stuff that I've said publicly, there's this idea that you can potentially converge these mobile devices and what we refer to as a high-end game console. there's a pretty significant performance gap there, and there are other challenges like their input challenges, their business model challenges. But in terms of pure performance, do you see a path to us narrowing that gap? And had the high-end game console guys been in pursuit of ultimate performance, like the high-end desktop GPU guys are, this is a senseless discussion. But they have cost constraints, which kind of force them to, and business model constraints, which force them to target maybe not what's possible within the TDP of that chassis. And as such, is there room for, high-end tablets and maybe even like a high-end docked smartphone to become a high-end game console or maybe an upper mid-range game console?
Well, I think you'll find the high-end tablets already are. So, okay, it depends on your definition of high-end. They're obviously not producing the graphics performance that you would get out of a modern console. But actually, consoles have quite a long life, and we're really at the same sort of performance levels as the previous generation, which everyone is still using. It's only really because the generations are so long up in the console space. It's only really the very modern ones that outpace a high-end tablet. So yeah, I think we can. The interesting thing will be to see how long this next generation is. There are industry insiders who are suggesting that the generations will actually get much longer up in the console space, not shorter. And
yeah, and that was,
consoles will be with us in 7, 10 years.
And that was the whole plan behind the last generation as well, right? If you look at the leaked documents about this generation, these Sony and Microsoft, they want to keep these things around for a decade, and obviously that makes your job easier when aiming for them as a target. I guess the question is how long do you believe before high-end mobile silicon, what you can find in a tablet, how long between where you are now and where the current crop of high-end modern consoles are, how long does it take us to make up that gap?
Well, we're still in the business where we have plenty of room to make up. So we are delivering, all of us, and I don't just mean ARM, but our competitors as well, are delivering an increase of around about a factor of 2 every year in terms of what we're cranking out. And that means, we are obviously accelerating the delivered performance faster than, the guys at the very top. Do we catch up with them? No, as I say, until we go water cooled and use 300 watts, there are some differences to where we will be. But yeah, we can go a long way there.
Do you think that during the lifespan of these next gen high-end consoles that we can get to a similar situation where we are today versus the previous generation of consoles with regards to high-end tablet performance?
Yes, I think so. I'll make a cautious prediction. Of course, as you say, the lifetime of those consoles is 10 years, then nobody will remember what we said on the subject anyway.
So I guess in pursuit of, the high end of performance and all of this, that there is the business model question, right? There is the question of, can we ever, if you look at mobile gaming today, a lot of it is the freemium model stuff. A lot of it is, there's this expectation that, hey, we can't justify paying a lot for a mobile game. Do you see that market getting to a point where we do have, maybe a AAA light title being developed first and foremost for mobile, or do you think it's always going to be those guys that spend the tens of millions of dollars, they aim at the high-end PC, high-end console, and then a few years passes and they try to reuse IP and mobile?
I think that there are a number of companies in this space who employ some very clever people, as discussed, are eyeing the size of the mobile market. You're looking at, 1 billion devices every year, which dwarfs, consoles, PCs, everything put together by, absolutely, almost an order of magnitude. And they will find a way around it. Yeah, I mean, there are, as you say, there are business model problems, there are payment model problems, there's security problems, but all of these are, well, they look soluble to me.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of the, I guess, piracy concerns, for example,
Hmm.
at least that are always being cited as to, hey, this is killing the industry. I feel
Yeah.
like a lot of that is already, at least if we look at the iOS ecosystem, a lot of that kind of gets solved, right? Because you have a huge portion of the customer base that, they're running licensed software, they're running kind of within the walled garden,
Yeah.
and they're used to paying for content.
Yes.
Um, so it's a I don't always want to hear people agree with me, but I'm glad to hear that you also think that there's there's a solution here.
I think there
Um,
is. I think there is a solution. I think it may still be a while before it's widespread, but yes, I think with a target market so big, with so much money at stake, I think engineers will solve the problem.
so let's talk about how to get there performance wise.
Hmm.
We used to have this kind of free lunch with Moore's Law where you got
Yeah,
smaller designs, higher performance, and lower power each generation.
yeah.
That free lunch has been over for a bit now. What's the path to getting substantial increases in GPU performance going forward? Is it still going to be driven by architecture just kind of hitting at each process node jump, or is there other stuff on the table that we're not looking at?
So Gordon Moore actually said you get more transistors every generation, and we're still getting more transistors. We are lucky in that most of the graphics problems we're looking at and the compute problems that are suitable for running on GPUs are easily parallelizable. So if you give me more transistors, I can build more cores, I can give you more performance. So we still have considerable scaling there. For a lot of our devices, the environment is not constrained by the size of the silicon, it's constrained by the heat budget. And the power consumption is not scaling in the same way as it used to. Certainly, the power consumption is tailing. The power consumption decrease is tailing off with the new generations. However, we are in for a pretty good generation coming up. With FinFETs, we see that power consumption will go down in a reasonable way, allowing us to increase core counts. We see some of our partners building chips on the new FinFET processes and increasing the number of cores to be put down. So we've got a good performance uplift to be had out of that. And of course, as it's not nearly so mature a technology and industry, there are still ways in which we can extract more performance out of the architecture as well. So, as I say, it's getting harder, no doubt about it, but we've still got room to go.
So FinFET is an obvious jump. Is there, let's talk about the memory bandwidth side of things.
Hmm.
Um, Memory bandwidth, that's you've got a ton of cores getting
Yeah.
access to main memory. That's always been a huge part of scaling GPU performance. How and when do you see us improving memory bandwidth to mobile GPUs and SoCs? Is it through integrated EDRAM and embedded SRAM, through wide I/O? Which or both? What happens first, and when do we get it?
All of the above. Bandwidth has to be picked off piecemeal, but whenever you can do anything about it. So we introduced ASTC as a texture compression method. Most of the bandwidth used in GPUs comes from reading textures or writing frame buffers. So, first off, we introduced ASTC, got that adopted as a standard. We were helped along the way by that, by some technology contributions from others in the industry. And we were very grateful for that from AMD. And ASTC is a fantastic standard, and probably will be the texture compression standard for a few years to go. Then you start looking at the memory bandwidth being written out. There's a resolution wars going on. More and more pixels, higher and higher frame rate. In some cases, more and more different screens. And so we looked at reducing that with AFBC, frame buffer compression, a lossless compression method, which enabled the simple premise is if we compress it and the display processor decompresses it, we'll actually spend less energy on that compression and decompression than we would by writing out to DRAM and reading back in. And we keep stuff on chip as much as possible, both with caching and also because we're a tile-based architecture. The tile buffer that we're doing most of our access to is on chip. Only once we finish processing a tile do we write out. And you just keep hitting the highest bars. So we've hit textures, we've hit frame buffer. Where do we go next? There'll be some further technologies we will introduce to reduce bandwidth even further.
So that's more focusing on making efficient use of your current bandwidth. What about that actual link to main memory? Do you see uh, the next move for mobile SoC vendors to kind of take a page out of what Microsoft did with the Xbox One and bring DRAM on die or on package, as in the case of Intel, or is wide I/O the next and kind of a TSV approach the next obvious step for mobile SoC vendors?
I'm always cautious about the next obvious step because I think different people will probably do, all of the above. Wide I/O certainly has a place. The more standard DRAM technologies are bringing down power and increasing bandwidth. One of the interesting things that comes with that is that the requirements from them on us change. So yes, they double the bandwidth, but only if we give them bigger transactions. So if your GPU writes out 3 bytes at a time, you are not going to get good bandwidth out of the new DRAMs. If you write out at 64 bytes and 128 bytes, 256 bytes at a time, larger and larger slices, then you'll get the performance that you want, the bandwidth that you require. So it becomes a system problem in the GPU. The GPU has to not only care about quantity of memory transactions, it has to care about the quality of those transactions. So you start getting into a stage where there's lots of plots on my office wall of histograms of transaction sizes coming out of our various processors. So it becomes a more complex problem. That's certainly the case for the new LPDDR standards. On the wide I/O side, we think that that's going to pay benefits anyway. And yes, some people will go along the line of putting down large quantities of either a system cache in SRAM or local memory, or putting down eDRAM if you've got access to that technology. And yeah, all of these approaches have merit. One of the great things, as I say, about being at a stage of slightly less maturity is that it's not all been solved. You talk to Peter Greenhalgh of the CPU architecture side. His job in some ways is harder because lots and lots and lots of things have already been settled. We've got fewer things that have absolutely been settled. We get a bit more flexibility, a bit more freedom to explore.
I guess if you were designing your ideal SoC, what would the GPU and memory bandwidth or memory interface configuration look like given today's technology?
Oh, well, my ideal SoC would have as much memory bandwidth as possible, and it would be attached to a cool running nuclear power station. If you ask a GPU guy how much bandwidth he wants, he just says, "No, give me everything you've got. Just give it to me, and I'll tell you how fast I can be if you tell me how much bandwidth you can give me." It's always that way around. A number of SoC vendors say, how much bandwidth should we have for you? And the answer is always as much as you can. As much as you can afford, given the target market you're approaching, and the silicon budget, and the power budget, and et cetera, et cetera.
Gotcha. So you did a round of Ask the Experts questions for us, and one question we saw come up quite a bit was this idea of, will ARM open source its Mali drivers? And I get the impression from your answer there that this is a much longer discussion, a much larger discussion that you could realistically have that much longer than you could put into text in a comment section. Take me through it. What are the challenges there as far as you see them when it comes to the decision to or not to open source the Mali drivers?
There are multiple axes on this of both engineering effort and of exposure to commercially and so on, and it's often not the ones that people harp on about. So could we open source our driver? Yes, clearly, feasibly, we could. Would we? Who controls that open source project once it's started? Who's going to gatekeep it? Who's going to be responsible for running it? There's a whole bunch of questions there. It is undoubtedly the case that the land of GPUs is more patent litigious than the land of CPUs. And one of the problems is that nobody can tell you how much this is all going to cost. It's very, very cheap, particularly in the US, for somebody to launch a patent suit, which then it may obviously have no merit, but it's going to cost an awful lot of money, both in lawyers' fees, but also in high quality technical time from my guys, my best people, to answer that lawsuit. And frankly, I'd rather have them working on building the next generation GPU, not working on some worthless lawsuit. And it's, we have risks there. We have to understand what our partners want. At the end of the day, as I explained before, we are very much doing what our partners ask us to, and predominantly they don't want open source, varying from couldn't care to actively not wanting us to do it. And yeah, it's a really, really complicated question. I could sit and talk about this for hours. The reason that you don't find us making firm statements on the subject is that there isn't a firm statement to make. In the end, it's always a compromise. It'll always be a commercial decision. And we will always, in the end, do what the market wants us to do. So I'm not going to say we're never going to do it. I'm not going to say we are going to do it. I'm certainly not going to give any timescales. It's a genuinely hard question.
So do you believe, if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like this is really it's a resource priority thing, right? If I'm going to if I've got $1, how much am I going to spend on what? And
Absolutely.
The obvious priority is on GPU development. The other thing that I'm hearing, though, is this focus on the litigation side. Do you believe that ARM gets put into a different position there as it grows its patent portfolio? All right, because the idea being that once your patent portfolio gets large enough, then no one really looks at suing you. They just look at cross-licensing agreements.
That's the case with technology companies. So you build up a patent portfolio, you enter into a negotiation, you get a cross-license, it's all good. It doesn't really protect you against the non-practicing entities, the people who have nothing to lose by suing you. If you're a technology company where you want to do business, they want to do business, come on guys, let's do a cross-license. I think ours is worth this, you think yours is worth that, maybe there's a cross-license fee, maybe it's free, blah, blah, blah. At the end of the day, you're just two companies looking to do business and finding an economic and sensible way through the morass. If you're a non-practicing entity, you have no reason not to sue. You just say, you have a hammer in your hand and everything looks like a nail, and you can't get costs awarded against you in the US courts. So it is trivially easy for you to invest $30,000 writing a lawsuit that costs ARM millions, and I do mean millions. I think a lot of people quite underestimate the scale of this to defend. And I got into this to do, as you say, it's all about spending $1, and I would much rather spend my dollars and my engineers' time building next generation innovative GPU, video processor, etc. I don't really want to be. I didn't get into this business to spend time in court, so it's hard. And don't get me wrong, I'm not giving legal advice here. There's a good way of getting in trouble in ARM is speaking as if you are legally qualified, and I'm not, obviously. But it's a side of the business I would prefer to avoid if at all possible.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So you mentioned video subsystems. Let's talk a bit about that. So you don't just handle GPUs, you're also responsible for video and display. These are areas that, with the exception of new kind of codec standards and codec targets, these aren't the most exciting things for people to talk about. So what's going on in those worlds? What should we be paying attention to?
Well, I think one of the interesting things to observe is if you said, "Oh, well, I'm thinking about getting a really high resolution device, and I want to watch these movies in great experience," the chances are your tablet is probably much better at that than your DTV. 4K TVs are not yet common. And so we have a very interesting resolution war going on in portable devices. There's more and more pixels to be had, and higher frame rates and better quality, and so people want the best possible experience. That gives you the opportunity to produce some products in that space that are genuinely innovative. It's not just the new codec standards. It gives you an opportunity to produce, for example, a video processor that scales down to, let's say, 720, and yet goes all the way up to 4K at the high end of the resolution and at 120 frames per second. Now, to produce an architecture that can genuinely scale across that performance spectrum is quite an interesting technical challenge, and we have guys who have done that, and I think we're going to make a great success out of that. Of course, as soon as you've produced all these pixels, somebody has to display them, and so there is room there for a display processor in the market as well. It used to be kind of somewhat looked down on. It used to be the job you gave the grad student, and a number of customers have come to us and said, well, actually, yeah, that's not good enough anymore. Taking all of that memory traffic in and doing something sensible with it, doing it in a power-efficient, bandwidth-efficient way, perhaps decompressing it, as we have with the AFBC compression, and getting it out onto a screen with good scaling, with good color rendition, good signal cleanup, etc., etc. This is now an interesting technical challenge that you have very talented people working on. So we don't see it at all as the poor relation.
Do you think there's any room for the integration of touch controller functionality into what you guys are doing on the display and video sides?
Probably yes. Though interestingly, the way the industry is sorted out is of a number of IP providers and component suppliers who were all different. So you've got the people making glass, you've got the people making LCDs, you've got the people making touch sensors, and oftentimes they're not the same company. So you have a very interesting and a diverse industry with a lot of players pushing. It's quite an interesting time to be in that industry.
So you think the way that it's decided to kind of unfold is just the way we'll see it kind of continue? I mean, I agree that we have these discrete providers of this sort of technology. It just seems that these are the types of things that should be integrated at some point.
Yes, I think the touch. Well, okay. Let me be controversial for a minute. I think if you can teach computers to understand vision, actually to understand what it is a camera is looking at. Oh, that's a person, that's a baby, that's a football. Then I think the change that's going to come through that will be every bit as revolutionary as touchscreen interaction was. So yes, I think obviously there is merit in integrating these functions, but there are other ways in which the way in which we interact with our digital world will change. Okay.
So that brings me to the end of the questions I've got. I've got a couple of follow-ups here from some of the audience, if you're okay with addressing them.
Absolutely. Yeah. Let's go.
So we do have a follow-up on the open source driver question. The point or question is that the resources needed for an open source driver is peanuts for ARM in comparison in its current market situation, especially based on the existing Lima driver. And then the argument is that
Hi, Luke. Nice to hear from you again, Luke.
Then sorry, this is Luke. And then he also argues that the patents are already an issue with what the Mali driver exposes already. Do you have a response to either of these?
It's very easy for anybody to say that blah 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 is peanuts compared to what ARM does on this, that, or the other. simplistic at best. I mean, you know, we are a corporation. We have a fiduciary responsibility to our shareholders, and when somebody says, "Oh, you know, it would only cost blah $1 million to do this. Why doesn't ARM do it? ARM can afford it." The answer is ARM shareholders don't want us to do that. They want us to do something that is more profitable. And
I think the other thing to point out though is from the ARM standpoint, there is ARM as a whole, but ARM's GPU division is a smaller component of the whole, right? So I'm assuming that,
and we have to make a profit on our own. We are run absolutely as a business that has to stand and fall on its own. We have our own profit and loss account, and there is no way that, you know, we are spending ARM CPUs revenues to support something that, you know, the market isn't going to pay for.
And what are your thoughts on the point that the patent question is already somewhat, that you're already exposing yourself to litigation based on what you already exposed through the Lima driver?
I think that exposing further obviously increases risk, and you know, trolls, however pointless their lawsuits are incredibly expensive to defend against. And the I cannot stress enough, I have nothing against open source in principle. It is a commercial decision, and anything you do something that is going to increase risk, you look at the reward and compare the risk-reward situation. It's really pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it does sound like it is very much a financial sort of priority. It is something that I also wonder if things change. You know, if ARM were the dominant mobile GPU vendor by far, and the revenues generated from that, you know, substantially contributed to a huge increase in ARM's position just as a company overall. I'm guessing that at that point things might, your decision may fall a little differently.
I'm always open to reevaluating that decision. I mean, you know, it is a decision we evaluate from time to time. It's not something, you know, I'm not taking a principled stand against it. At some point, you know, I have to go into my boss's office and say, I want to spend this money on blah, and he's going to ask me why. And, you know, for whatever it is, it might be, I want to build a new GPU, I want to build a new display processor, I want to move into supercomputing, you know, I want to build the world's first petaflop computer. You know, there will be a story, and there will have to be, before he gives me any money, there will have to be a business case.
Okay. So we got another question here from Charles, and the question here is whether your GPU can automatically detect and fix overdraw. I believe the question is implying, can you automatically detect and fix overdraw in Android UI situations, right? So can you know, your rejection engine, your early rejection that you do, can it auto fix overdraw and direct and reduce jank on Android?
Yes. I mean, every GPU manufacturer has its own technology for eliminating redundant transactions. You know, we cull back-facing triangles, for example. If a pixel is in a queue and it is going to completely overwrite a pixel that's already in the queue, then the one that's already in the queue will get discarded. We do early Z testing on all sorts of things. I mean, there are any number of technologies in there, some of which are standard, some of which are interesting and proprietary. And yeah, we try. Graphics is all about cheating. You cheat as much as possible. If you actually did all of the work that the user asked you to do, your performance would be terrible, because the content that you get given is often full of instructions to do things that you're never going to see. They will quite often present you with geometry and texturing and stuff that is actually out of view. You know, it's never going to be seen. So you try not to do that. Yeah, they'll quite often give you overdraw where, you know, they'll tell you in infinite detail how to do something and then overwrite it with something else. So everybody is all the time trying to address this issue. And yes, if we get it right, it makes for a smoother performance and less jank.
Awesome. So the only other point that I want to make here is you got Marco saying to thank you for great work with ASTC. I want to thank you, Jem, for spending the past hour with us. I want to thank you all for watching. We will be posting this directly to our YouTube channel if you caught it in the middle or if you want to watch it later. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you very much indeed.